Mark Feeney is a Pulitzer Prize-winning arts writer at the Boston Globe. The Pulitzer citation praised his penetrating and versatile command of the visual arts. He writes mostly about photography and film. And today, on the Crit House, Mark Feeney discusses his myFIVE images from Arnold Newman, Gary Winterand, Louise Farrer, Alex Webb, and Russell Lee. We normally talk to like photographers and curators and editors and publishers. We've talked to a couple people who write about photography, but usually it's like they're writing for photographers. And I just had this idea that it would be great to talk to somebody who writes for the general public. And you are a Pulitzer Prize winning writer for the Boston Globe. You write for the general public. And I thought that would be a good conversation to have. So how do you fit into the photography world, or how do you maybe view the photography world is a better way of putting it?
Well, I view the world with great respect and admiration because I can't take pictures worth a damn, and I love looking at pictures. But I fit into it in that when I write about a photography, I am a surrogate for the reader. I represent the reader rather than representing the institution that's showing the photographs or the photographers themselves. I mean, I always try to be fair to the photographer. Even if I don't like the work, I try to get a sense of why he or she is doing this particular thing. And I mean, in some ways, that's one of the greatest challenges in reviewing, and it's fine if I love something, that's easy. If I hate it, it's even easier, assuming I can write about it at all. No, the easiest kind of review to write is total pan, which is, I mean, that's sort of the dark, dirty secret of reviewing. A rave gets tricky because if you go on too much, people might think, oh, there's something funny here, dial it down. But if it's work that I don't like, but the artist statement or accompanying materials make plain the seriousness of it and the way in which the photographs really do honor those ideals, then it's part of my job is to, I can't say I like it, but I have to make plain the seriousness and the effectiveness of those works.
Well, so that kind of goes to a little bit of a question we touched on before we started recording here is like, so, and again, this might be, as we discussed, a semantic difference, but
right.
You are a reviewer. That's how you sort of when
fact,
you say reviewer.
My job title, if you look me up in the Globe union contract, I am an arts writer. I'm not even a reviewer or a critic. I'm an arts writer.
But so what's the difference between a critic?
Well, I can tell you how I see the difference,
Yes.
Which may well not be how the dictionary sees it or others see it. But to me, again, speaking journalistically, there's a whole different thing in terms of academic writing. But as a journalist, if you're seeing a show, a movie, reading a book, attending a concert, and then you write about it in an evaluative way, not just repertorial, you are reviewing it. You're not, I mean, criticism, critique, it's just overblown and self-important. And it just drives me crazy when people, some of them are dear friends of mine, refer to themselves as, a critic. You're a version of reporter, and that's an honorable thing to do. And don't put yourself above what it is you're writing about.
Well, I appreciate that clarification because I honestly I didn't.
Well, it's just it's my own rule of thumb, and as I say, it's probably very much a minority view, but it's just. I mean, I just hate self-importance, and especially in culture. It's like, anyway.
I buy into it. Thanks. So you have We gave you this assignment that we give to everybody on the program of choosing 5
And it's
images
a very
that
diabolical assignment.
no one
Within
says thank you
viewers,
for.
what he does is he asks you, as you know, for 5 things. Literally within 2 minutes of having sent my 5, I started thinking about swapping out one of them for a different one. And then I said, I didn't do it. And I don't even think that way. Just stop it. Stop it.
Well, there are some great people. Most recently, Sarah Lean, who was the first female photo director for National Geographic. She was on the day that we were recording, still sending new images and changing things out. So
Yeah.
it is an instinct that a lot of people have. But so how did you decide? What's the process you went through in
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
choosing
yeah.
images?
The first one came to me because it was the first image I am aware of having looked at and thinking of it in artistic terms, if that makes sense. I mean, growing up, you see pictures in the newspaper and magazine. Wow, it's a great picture. And then after that, the second one, it's a little known work by a very well known photographer, and it's always stayed with me. The third is maybe the most heartbreaking photograph I know. Well, no, I mean, I can think of photographs of horrible events, but in terms of just daily life, it's so
Yeah.
heartbreaking. And it touches on the movies, and I love them. The fourth, in a funny way, is I didn't really think of this until I made the selection, a kind of inside out version of the third one. Final one, I only saw a year or two ago. And, I've been looking at pictures a long time, as we all have. And the image glut is just so overwhelming. It's
Yeah.
really hard for an image to jump out at me.
Hmm.
But this was part of, I guess I shouldn't mention the details, I'll be talking about it more later. But anyway, as soon as I saw it on a computer screen, not on a wall, I was enchanted. And my enchantment has not diminished whatsoever in the intervening 2 years.
Well, let's go spend a little time with those images.
All right.
This one, to me, I think of the Arnold Newman Stravinsky image. I think of this as the greatest crop in the history of photography.
Yes, yes, yes.
Tell us about how this influenced you, Mark Feeney.
Yeah, I say it influenced me, but certainly how it affected me. I was in college. This would have been in '78, I think, and I was a newly minted member of WGBH, and back then GBH sent out a monthly program guide, and there was this thumbnail. I mean, it was a thumbnail. It was this small of this photograph. I guess to accompany some series on the radio of Stravinsky. And I saw it and it just, whoa. And I was so impressed. I actually clipped it out and put it on my bulletin.
Hmm.
And um, what's interesting, so it has personal meaning in being, so far as I can recall, the first serious photograph that jumped out at me as a serious photograph. But it's also interesting because it's something of an index of how my tastes have changed in that it's almost abstract, the way in which Newman uses the lid of the piano and has it up to look like a musical note.
Yep.
The way in which the one human element in it, Stravinsky himself, and ostensibly the occasion for the photograph, is relegated off to the side and is dominated by the piano. It's in a funny way, it's a bit like Stravinsky's music. It doesn't have a real sense of humanity to it, but it's
Mm.
a knockout to look at. And also, like any good photograph, it lends its. As soon as you start thinking about it, talking about it, all kinds of other things emerge. The relationship of music, how the music ultimately is more important than the composer. So the piano dominates Stravinsky himself. And of course, the most abstract of all the arts is music,
Yeah.
though it's also the form of art that is most powerful, perhaps. And in that sense, having it be such a geometric, reduced composition is lacking in color, is quite appropriate to the subject matter. And anytime you can get more levels out of, I mean, a photograph literally is just a single level. It's those two dimensions right there in front of you, flat,
Yeah.
flat, flat. I mean, even a painting with impasto isn't altogether flat. But a good picture has all these levels underneath it. And it's just such fun, whether it be in conversation or writing or just thinking about it, reaching those other levels. A photograph is about an image. It is an image, but insofar as it can generate, the more it can generate a verbal response, I think, the more that speaks to its richness and greatness and why it deserves to endure. Well, and maybe a photographer rather than a viewer of photography would disagree and say it's the intrinsic visual nature that matters. But coming at it as I do from a verbal or literary uh, perspective, that to me is if it crosses over, if you from the visual to the verbal, that really says something. One of the things that I love, because it can never be resolved, is talking to the kids about how um, Walker Evans, for all that he loved getting words and letters into his photographs, was vehement on the subject that explanation or messages, extra visual messages, were utterly superfluous and undercut the image. Whereas Dorothea Lange, almost his exact contemporary, and both of them, of course, working for the Farm Security Administration, completely disagreed. Adding in words and messages greatly enhanced any photograph. And here you have two of the supreme photographers of the 20th century disagreeing.
Yeah,
You can't square it. And that's great. But that
yeah.
speaks to the absolute richness of the medium.
So, number two, Gary Winterand. And I have to say, you sent this image. I was like, I've never seen this image.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Well, as we know, there are many Winogrands
yes.
that Winogrand didn't see because he was a maniac about taking pictures. And at the time of his death, there were literally hundreds of thousands
Yes.
that had never been developed.
Never been seen.
This one had been, but it's undated. It's from the 50s, but it's undated. And I was the assistant book editor at the Boston Globe and would get in review copies, and especially the photo books I'd like to look at. And one of them was the catalog of the retrospective, Winogrand retrospective that John Charkovsky put together at MoMA after Winogrand's death. A brief aside, in 2001, in fact, it was the second Friday after 9/11, I spent an afternoon talking to Charkovsky, sitting outside his weekend house in the New York side of the Berkshires. And it was just, I mean, Charkovsky was just so smart and just, if you said to me there's only one person you can read on photography, I'd say it's John Charkovsky, because it's not just that he knew so much, in part because he was himself a practitioner, but also he was such a good. Anyway, so and it wasn't, and part of the interest too is historical, and he was so important. He promoted Arbus, he promoted Winogrand, he promoted Friedlander,
Yep.
among others. So I'm paging through, and this picture, there's just such an air of mystery to it.
Yeah.
Once you step back, formally it's interesting the way in which you get the play of the hat on the rack against the play of the circle of the hat on the man looking down, the circularity of the man sitting down, his head, and how those play against the verticality of the hat rack, and the squareness, or not square, but the rectilinearness of the frame. And yet the single biggest element in the picture is that kind of glare behind the two faces. It's so mysterious, and in and of itself, and yet in an utterly mundane way. I mean, there's nothing about it that declares a sense of mystery or imminence or religiosity. And then there's the wonderful twist at the end, which I had never thought of until I sent this to you. Who's the greatest street photographer of all time?
Well, either Cartier-Bresson or Robert Frank.
Oh, well, I would say Gary Winogrand. Well, or who's the most prolific would be Winogrand.
Oh, well.
See, I don't necessarily think of Frank or Cartier-Bresson street guys, because they also they sort of encompass so much more.
Yeah, I guess that's right.
Well, in any event, this is an interior. He's not out on the street. And it's Winterand. So I like that. But as I say, that's an ex post facto realization.
It,
But
it,
it's
it had,
another example of how the more you look at a picture, the more you see. Or you always see, but then you recognize. Just that expression on the man's face. You know,
yeah.
in this society, and it's not just now, it's probably always been this way. But visually, we are slaves to the beautiful and to a lesser extent to the grotesque.
Hmm.
It's so rare that we are presented with, in a serious way, the everyday, the humdrum, the plain. And so that face, it's just there. It's not staring at us, it's staring at the other man, but in a weird way, that gives us license to look at it all the more.
Your third image from
The third
Louis
image, Louis
Four.
IV, who's a really interesting guy that not enough people know about. He was a good friend. In a funny way, I think he suffered for the fact that he was very good friends with Frank. In
Ah,
fact, one of my favorite portraits of Frank, a very young Frank, pre-Americans, was taken by Four. And he suffers for it just because, I mean, Frank is just Frank.
yeah.
And Louis was really good. And I bet if we, did a show on him, your viewers would recognize a fair number of his images. But he's he just isn't situated as prominent as perhaps he deserves. Anyway, this picture. This is taken in Times Square in the late 40s. It's undated. And it just breaks my heart
Yeah.
every time I look at it. Here are these four women. Presumably, we know it's night. Uh, my assumption is that they're on their way home from work, but maybe it's the weekend. I just automatically assumed it was a weeknight and that they're waiting for a bus or something. But each is so different in appearance, um, and yet they're all probably the same class. Lower middle class women who back then had the kind of jobs that they were limited to, secretary work, perhaps
Hmm.
clerical work. They're all looking in different directions. They just look so sad. And then
The text.
staring behind them
Yeah.
is Barbara Stanwyck.
Oh, is that who that is?
That's
Oh,
Barbara Stanwyck. Yeah,
oh,
and it's a movie, a very strange movie, which it took me a while to figure out what it was because the lettering is so limited. But what the title of the movie is, the AM is man. It's no man of her own, which is a sort of combination noir woman's picture that Mitchell Leisen, was sort of a second rank Hollywood director. It's pretty good movies, but he wasn't, Billy Wilder or Lubitsch did. This picture is it's not just one novel; it's multiple novels. Each
yeah.
woman's life could be a novel,
Yeah.
certainly a movie. And you get the larger and where are they? They're in Times Square, the most exciting, pulsating place on the continent. And just look at the expressions on their faces. I mean, that's why I think it's a weeknight. They look like people who have, worked 9 to 5 and have been drained by their jobs and just are ready to go home.
Right.
And it's not summertime. It's not winter, but they're wearing jackets. And then part of what for me breaks my heart, but also just as a social detail, which is the kind of thing photography does better than anything. Two of them are wearing white gloves.
Yeah.
Now, maybe it's partly to keep off the cold, where the other two women don't have gloves on, but they're white. And I think it's, about a formality to trying to look classy. And interestingly enough, 5 or 6 years ago, purely by chance, online, I came across a picture that Ford took either a second or two after
I
this.
saw that. Yeah. There's another one
And it's
without the
and the
without the
woman
guy.
in the middle is probably, I think, the most striking of the four. Her eyes are closed.
Oh.
And it's, but people close their eyes all the time. There's nothing unusual about it. But in visual terms, it's so unusual. And to see that juxtaposed with this image is just, it just turned my head around.
Fascinating.
And it also spoke to something that we tend not to think about, which is how, unless it's a situation that calls for uh, ecstasy or uh, confusion, we never see people with or sleep. We never see people with their eyes closed.
Unless they're
It's
blinking.
a kind of visual convention.
Yeah.
Or the blinking, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, I just love this picture. I just love this picture.
I do too. Thanks for
Oh,
sharing it and talking about it. Russell, Lee, with your fourth image.
yeah, which is kind of an inside out. Again, it hadn't occurred to me until I undertook this exercise. So thank you. This was taken. So we've got the picture before, and to my way of thinking, and viewers may disagree, it's just suffused with sadness. But it's the it is the American night, the American urban night, but suffused with sadness. Here is a different American urban night, but it's about promise and possibility. And yet, the previous picture is from the late 40s. America is the most powerful land in the world, the most prosperous land in the world. Even though these women, I was talking a moment ago about how they look kind of sad and so on and so forth, they are enjoying a degree of prosperity pretty much unknown anywhere else in the world. Well, this is 1940. America's at war. It is conceivable that the Axis could win. So, in global terms, there is a degree of menace here that is not at all the case in the previous one.
Yeah.
And yet, to me, whether it be because of the wonderful posture of the man entering the theater, the kind of Renaissance contrapposto,
Yeah.
or because of the confident stance of the man in uniform, because it's 1942, standing by the ticket booth, the relaxed stance of the man over on the left, looking at presumably a poster or something, or information on show times. It just feels so alive and alert, and the promise of the American urban night. This is a real jump, but one of the greatest images of the 20th century, and maybe the greatest political image of the 20th century, is "I Am a Man," the protest, the picture that he took of the Memphis sanitation workers on strike before Dr. King came to Memphis, and as we know, was murdered in Memphis, supporting the striking workers. But what does it consist of? You see the faces. Mostly, they're all holding little posters that say, "I am a man.
Right.
I am a man. I am a man." Sans serif, black on white. It's just, oh, it's magnificent.
Oh.
It's better than the fucking Bill of Rights of the Constitution. So I'm getting far afield. I'm sorry. I tend to do this.
No, I love it. This is
But
why we do this
letters
conversation.
and words within the frame, however paradoxically, almost always in my experience, enhance the visual experience. They enrich it. And that's part of why I love this picture. And also the play between the light against the dark. And this is the most interesting of all, to my way of thinking. Again, it's the spring of 1942. America is at war. Look at all these lights.
Yeah.
Nowhere in Europe at night are lights on.
Right. Blackout.
And say, well, of course, we're 3,000 miles away. This is the same country that at this very same time was putting tens of thousands of U.S. citizens into concentration camps because they were afraid of being attacked. And yet we can leave the lights on.
It's interesting to think of that timeline. Yeah, that's
Anyway.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. So,
all right.
And that's the other thing of a picture. One of the other things, as artifacts of history, nothing can match them. Nothing can match them.
Right.
Because, of course, a photograph is about the past. The instant, it's about time, but it's always about the past, because the instant the shutter clicks, that's it. It's over.
Yeah. Your fifth image, the one you've seen most recently.
Yes.
In the last year, I think you said, from Alex Webb.
Yeah, it was like, I think it was spring of maybe 2023. I get a weekly email from Magnum about shows they're mounting, or pictures they have, or members of Magnum, they're honoring. And this one was about Alex Webb. And I just saw this picture and I just grinned. It just made me so happy. All I knew is Alex Webb. It didn't have a date. It didn't have location. Didn't have a title. And so, and I was so, and I'm the kind of person I really need to know dates and titles and whereabouts. But this one was so delightful. I didn't care. I just wanted to take it in. The color, and I tend to be, as the four predecessors might indicate, I tend to be a black and white guy. I'm no longer religious on the subject. I mean, I love Eggleston, I love Kristen Berry, but I do still prefer black and white. But the colors are so fabulous more than anything else. Those two young women on the left, are they dancing? Are they just sharing some good news? But there's such a sense of joy and excitement and pleasure about them, just further enhanced, of course, by the wonderful redness of the woman on the right's dress, which in turn chimes with the redness of the uh, trousers, sweatpants, whatever they are, the man on the right is wearing, and the fact that he's cut off and you can't see the little girl's face, and you got people in the background. It's just, on the one hand, it's a complete jumble, the way cities are, and is part of the joy of cities.
Yeah.
And yet it all arranges itself so
Absolutely.
wonderfully.
So he's so
But
masterful that way of
yeah,
taking so many different elements, both throughout the frame, framing it in front and back, and the colors. It's yeah, it's brilliant.
and again, I had not at all intended this, but it occurs to me that it makes for a very interesting comparison with the Newman Stravinsky portrait. We're talking about how abstract and geometric it is. I mean, the obvious difference is that's in black and white, but this is so pared down, and the composition is so conscious. Whereas with Webb, it's so full of stuff,
Yeah.
and yet it is in its own way as pleasingly, as impressively composed, if not as self-consciously composed as the Newman Stravinsky is. And
Absolutely.
I should add, mentioned a moment ago, oh, I have to know all this information. I did finally track it down. It's Barcelona, which somehow feels right. I mean, it looks like Barcelona.
It
I've
does, yeah.
never been to Barcelona, but
But you can
my
feel it.
sense of Barcelona is like that. 1992.
Well, Mark Feeney, boy, what a fount of information and knowledge and great perspectives on these photographs. It's
I get pissed out of the drunk.
thanks, thanks so much for coming on the program,
Well,
and
thank you for asking. It was great fun.
yeah, I liked it.
So
And I love.
again, I really resent the fact that all these other pictures, I wish I'd chosen now, but of course I didn't. But that's
You
just
you
the way it
you
is.
smartly managed to reference some of them aside from the five image. So,
Oh, journalists, very slippery characters.
well, again, thank you very much. Pleasure talking to you, and I want to thank you all for watching the Crit House as well.